Hi everybody, thank you for joining me. So I am building my ultimate Beatles and solo album ranking video based on my enjoyment of the albums. I've already done Paul McCartney, I did John Lennon last time round, this time I'm doing George Harrison. And then at the end we're going to add Ringo's albums and all the Beatles albums in to create an overall ranking based on my enjoyment of these albums of everything that the Beatles and the solo members did. So you might want to watch the Paul and John episodes first, because at the end I'm going to throw George's albums into the ranking that's been built up so far. So you might want to see how that's been built. There'll be links down in the description, comments up there potentially, etc. But what I'm going to do, I've got all George's albums here. I'm going to start off with the first two albums that he released while he was still in the Beatles, his two experimental albums, Wonderwall Music and Electronic Sound. I'm going to rank those. And then, like I did with John and his experimental albums, I then went to the end of the career and worked backwards chronologically. So that's kind of what's going to happen. So first up is Wonderwall Music, the soundtrack album to the movie Wonderwall, that completely wild back end of the 60s movie. And I find this to be an enjoyable album, and I have done ever since I first heard it quite a few years ago now. It's not all George. There's other people involved in this, but it's crazy. It's wacky. If you like the sort of if you like the magical mystery tour kind of wackiness, there's going to be plenty to enjoy here. It's not very cohesive. It's not got many things that are what you'd class as actual songs. But if I sit down now and put this on, I will enjoy it immensely, and that's what I'm talking about in these rankings, is my enjoyment. So Wonderwall Music kicks us off. It goes into the list on its own because it's number one, and we're going to see how the other albums all around it fit. So next up, George released Electronic Sound, and even more so, there's a lot of this that isn't even George, and it's a tough listen, let's make no bones about it. Can I get enjoyment from this album? I certainly did do once. I put coloured lighting on in the room very, very dimly. I was almost in the dark, just a bit of coloured light. Turned this up loud, and it was sort of quite enjoyable in a Freaky Friday night kind of way with a couple of beers inside me. But I would really have to be in the right kind of mood to get any kind of enjoyment from this. Certainly not to anywhere near the level that I would with Wonderwall Music. So it's no surprise that it's going behind Wonderwall Music at the moment into second place. So as I said, now I've done those two experimental albums from the start of his career, I'm now going to go to the end of George's career and work my way backwards chronologically. And of course we have Brainwashed to start off here, the album that it was completed after George passed away, but surely the bulk of it is what would have formed George's next album. And I have an interesting relationship with this album in that there's about half of it that I absolutely adore, and there's another half that never quite seems to lodge in my brain so much and kind of washes over me. But if I was to pick out my highlights on this album, it would definitely be Any Road, P2 Vatican Blues. Marwa Blues is gorgeous, and I love how that was used in the Living in the Material World documentary. Towards the end, it's really sort of atmospheric and gorgeous. Stuck Inside a Cloud, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, and Brainwashed at the end. It was really interesting to see that on Brainwashed, the last song on his last album, it's got a return to sort of Indian vibes, but it's well worth it for the things that are the highlights to me on that album. And definitely, as much as I love Wonderwall Music, this has to go above it, and currently into first place on my chart. We then go back to Live in Japan from George's tour that he did with Eric Clapton in the early 1990s. And this is an album that I struggled with for many years. I first bought this on CD not long after it came out at all, and I really did struggle with it. I like it more in recent years, and there's certain things on here that it kind of depends on. It feels like what George's mood is on a particular song and how much he's feeling the song really comes over on the speakers into and sort of transcribes into how much I'm going to enjoy it. So when it starts off, it's kind of decent, nice versions early on of I Want to Tell You How, Old Brown Shoe Taxman. And then you hear the first sort of hints with Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth that actually George is feeling it a lot more on this song, and I think that benefits it, and I as a listener like it a lot more as a result of that. And certainly towards the end, when Isn't It a Pity kicks in, you feel that feels like the highlight of the album to me, where George really means what he's singing, and you can tell that he's singing a song that's really, really important to him. Some of the rest of it I feel is just, okay, it's George singing live, fair enough, but then other times, like I say, you can really sense him feeling it. So it's a bit of a mixed bag for me as Live in Japan, and currently I would say I enjoy Wonderwall music more than this, so this is going into third place at the moment. We then go back to 1987's CloudNine. It was a big return to form for George, I feel. For me, this was the first time that I really got to hear George as a solo artist, because going back previously to Gone Tropo, that kind of era, I was just a bit too young to have really been taking any notice of what George was doing. But hearing Got My Mind Set on You, and not knowing at the time that it was a cover version, I don't think I knew that for quite a while, that he'd done a cover there. But hearing that, you just think, oh, this is George, he's back, what a great song, what a great pop song of the era. And it was a great pop song of the era. I have a similar kind of relationship with this album to what I do with Brainwashed, where, again, those highs are absolutely fantastic and brilliant, and then there's other bits of the album that again, kind of pass me by a little bit. So the highlights, CloudNine, great song. Fish on the Sand is a lot of fun. This Is Love, beautiful love song. When We Was Fab, of course, George finally embracing his Beatles past. What a lot of fun it was seeing him do that, and seeing the video with sort of all the visual clues there to the past. That was great to see George doing that. Devil's Radio is a song that I really, really enjoy. And of course, got my mind set on you at the end. The others, as I say, kind of passed me by a little bit. But for those highs, it's absolutely worth it. It's great to see George smiling on the cover as well. This is very much, a lot of this is Happy George, and I've always been a big fan of Happy George. No doubt that this goes into #1 position at the moment in the ranking. We then go back to Gone Tropo. So like I say, we're going back a bit before I really would have been listening to George. And I've come to really enjoy the side A on this album recently, and there's a bit of a theme with a few of George's albums where it feels to me as though it's side A is where all the best stuff has been put. And I think that's the case here. I think it's a really strong start to this album with Wake Up My Love, That's the Way It Goes, I Really Love You. That's a great 3-song opening, I think, on here. After that, I don't think it keeps that same level up for the rest of the album, but based on that start, I can take quite a lot of enjoyment from this album. It builds up a lot of favour in me from the beginning that it has. I always thought as well when Egypt Station came out that the cover of Egypt Station was very reminiscent of Gone Tropo's cover. But I digress. Where am I putting Gone Tropo in my ranking at the moment? It's going in 4th place at the moment, just above Live in Japan in terms of enjoyment. Next up, it's Somewhere in England, and here it is with its cover as it was released at the time. But George did have his preferred cover that didn't make it out until many years later. I've never been particularly keen on that cover. I prefer this one. In terms of the album itself, it's an album that I've really started to enjoy a lot more over the last 2 or 3 years, and I find this an enjoyable album pretty much from start to finish. Of course, the big hitter on here is All Those Years Ago, George's tribute to John Lennon after he passed away. We've got Paul on here, we've got Ringo on here, Linda's on here, Denny Lane, George Martin was involved. So it's kind of that big reunion song. You've also got Baltimore Oriole on here, which, although I said I really tend to like Happy George, this is a really moody song and I think it's fantastic. Originally a Hoagie Carmichael song from the 1940s, but George does a great cover of it on here. Teardrops, I think, is a great opening to side 2, really upbeat and happy. Similarly with Save the World, even though it's not a particularly happy topic to be singing about, it's a good upbeat song, and I find this album enjoyable pretty much from start to finish, and I'm putting it at the moment in 4th place, just behind Wonderwall Music. This was a big decision for me to make, But I think the sort of general craziness of Wonderwall music just won out on me in the end. Now we move on to George's self-titled album, George Harrison. Fantastic cover shot there. I really love that. And a great picture of George on the back. I mean, despite the perm. Let's give the perm a pass here. Still great photos. This album is an interesting one. I find it to be nice all the way through. There's no massive highs on here. There's no terrible lows. It's just a nice, enjoyable album from start to finish. Again, it starts off great. Love Comes to Everyone. Not Guilty. The song that the Beatles recorded nearly 100 takes of in 1968 and still couldn't manage to get it on the White Album. It finally comes out here. Here Comes the Moon, a beautiful follow-on to Here Comes the Sun. Soft-Hearted Hannah is a nice kind of like a Western piano barroom kind of song. Blow Away, another great George pop song of the era. And it's just great all the way through. Faster, his song that he kind of wrote to order as a love song to Formula One racing. So I find it enjoyable all the way through, but it's not got those massive highs that some of the other albums have. But at the moment, I think it's worthy of going into third place. It's finally knocking Wonderwall music down a place. This goes in third. Going back in time, a further one album, we are back to 33 1/3. So this is another one of those George albums where I feel that side A is probably where the best stuff is going to be found. I think it's a fantastic side A. Woman Don't You Cry For Me, Dear One, Beautiful Girl. What a song that is. It's a song that when I bought the George Harrison album box set that all these are from, it was a song that was probably the biggest winner of the whole box for me in terms of lifting its status from what I'd previously known it as to what it became for me. I think it's just an absolutely great song. This song as well, a lot of fun. George obviously poking fun at the music industry after his lawsuit over My Sweet Lord when he was sued for it sounding like the chiffons He's So Fine. Crazy fun video set in a courtroom to it as well, but it's just John having a laugh at the craziness of the music industry. When we get to side 2, the standout song for me would be Crackerbox Palace. I've always really enjoyed that since the Best of Dark Horse album that came out in the early 90s, which really sort of fired up my love for George as a solo artist along with All Things Must Pass. But I think this is a really enjoyable album and probably just edges out the self-titled album that we looked at previously, and this now goes up into third place currently. Next album up is Extra Texture. Now this is an album that until about 3 or 4 years ago I really had little affection for at all. But I've grown to like it a lot more. But again, side A is where I think the best songs are packed on this album. It was a common theme in George's albums from my perspective anyway. It might be different for you, let me know. But I think it gets off to probably its highest point right at the start with You, which despite this being an album that is, there's a lot of misery and downbeat stuff on this album. You is one of the happier George songs by far and really benefits for it. I also like This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying on side A. I think that's a really good song. I really like the remix of it that appears on sort of CD reissues in recent years. That's a really good remix that's worth checking out. The rest of the album doesn't do a great deal for me, but I think in terms of what's at the start on side A, I'm certainly finding that more enjoyable these days, but it is absolutely not one of my favourites. And it's going at the moment down into 9th place, just above Electronic Sound. I say just above. It's considerably above, but 1 place above. We then go back to Dark Horse. Now, around the time of Dark Horse Extra Texture, George was having problems with his voice that was really not helping him at all. And this album is an album I still struggle with, to be honest. There's definitely benefit, I think, in a remix of this album because a lot of it sounds quite muddy to me, and I think there could be a lot of elements brought out on this album and Extra Texture as well with a remix. I think there's certain things that sound like they're trying to be a bit funky, but it's just a bit buried in the mix. I struggle with a lot of this album, I'm going to be honest. Harry's on Tour as an opener. It's okay, but it's nothing that's going to excite me at all. And to be honest, there isn't really anything on this album that does excite me. It just doesn't do it for me. Maybe it does it for you. There's a cover of the Everly Brothers' Bye Bye Love on here, and the best thing about that by far is that George has changed the words so that it's now a song reflecting Patty leaving him for Eric Clapton. So it's quite interesting lyric changes there, but that really is the most interesting thing about it. And I can't really get to grips with this at the moment, but like I say, I would love to hear a remix of it to see what they can do with it and hopefully lift the album for me. So I'm kind of open to hopefully enjoying this more in the future than I do currently. But I have to put it below Extra Texture and above Electronic Sound. It goes in to my chart in 10th place. We go back to George's second studio album from when his solo career properly started, Living in the Material World. This is George on absolute top form, I think. Again, pretty much start to finish. It's an album that I don't see much of the happy George that I've said I like on here, but when he's feeling it as much as he feels it on this album, and when he's singing about subjects that clearly mean so much to him, it's impossible to ignore. These are great songs that are on here. If I'm going to pick out my highlights, I think at the start, Give Me Love, Peace on Earth is a superb opening. The Light That Has Lighted the World is just a gorgeous song. Don't Let Me Wait Too Long. Again, it's just really, really beautiful George Harrison writing on there. Living in the Material World, the title track, is a really interesting one because you've got George looking back on the past, looking back to early Beatles days, been out on tour with the rest of the band and sort of looking to make money, and just really interesting hearing George sing that kind of a song. It's almost like, you know, when we was Fab, we say that, oh, George is finally embracing his Beatles history, but, you know, he did on that song as well. Brief mention towards it, but he's clearly mentioning it in there. And again, right through to the album, it's just class all the way through. A real big hit for George, and deservedly so. And I can really do nothing else other than put this, at the moment, at number 1 in terms of enjoyment. Next up, it's an album that I don't have on vinyl. In fact, I don't even have it on CD. I have got a digital copy of it, but I've got the DVD of the concert for Bangladesh. So the 2 concerts that George put on at Madison Square Garden to try and raise funds for the crisis that was happening in Bangladesh at the time. And it's a really interesting album. Obviously, the fact that we've got George Harrison on stage doing a proper concert for the first time since he had done with the Beatles in '66. He'd done a couple of little sort of guest appearances here and there in between, but as a full-on George concert, and for him out there solo, this really was a first. And this paved the way, obviously, for the likes of Live Aid to come along years later, and all the big charity concerts that we've had since. So there's some good versions on here of some of George's classic songs. Wah Wah, My Sweet Lord, Waiting on You All, for example. And then you've got the guests that come in. I want to concentrate mainly on the George element of this album because of the nature of this video. But it's interesting having Ringo doing It Don't Come Easy. Leon Russell does a bit of a medley of a few things like Jumping Jack Flash and Youngblood. And then you've got the Bob Dylan songs, which, despite being a massive Bob Dylan fan, I'm not too bothered about the Bob Dylan live stuff on here. I tend to go elsewhere for my Bob Dylan live fixes. But then George comes on to great applause when he starts doing Here Comes the Sun, and the same with Something. So it was great that he was embracing kind of the best of his Beatles output as well. And of course with While My Guitar Gently Weeps. So I do find this an enjoyable album. Also as well, the title song, if you like, Bangladesh, that he wrote especially for this. I think that's a really good song. So it is an enjoyable album. I've put it at the moment in 9th place, just below Gone Tropo. But yeah, I did rewatch this again just recently and really enjoyed it. I would love there to be some sort of expanded edition of this come out soon. It has been hinted by the Harrison camp as been something that they're working on. So as I sit here in August 2022, I hope we get some massive box set of this at some point in the future. So last up, before I take these George rankings and smash them into combining them with the John and Paul rankings that I've already done, Last up, of course, is All Things Must Pass. This is my 50th anniversary 3-disc version. I've got a 2014 remaster up there. I've got various versions of All Things Must Pass, basically because I love this album so much. I did a album of the decade video a couple of years ago for the 1970s, and I ranked this as my favourite album of the 1970s by anybody. So that tells you a little bit about the love that I have for this album. It's epic. What words can we think? Epic, definitely. It's spiritual. It's just superb from start to finish. I prefer this as a 2-disc album, ending with Hear Me Lord. The Apple Jam I tend to think of as bonus tracks. And there is a quote from George as well where he sort of tended to consider similar. So I've no problem myself in thinking that. So I'm regarding this as the album up to Hear Me Lord. So it gets off to a slow but nice start with I'd Have You Anytime. My Sweet Lord, obviously one of the great songs of the era, or indeed of any era, potentially. Landed him in a lot of legal bother, as we talked about earlier on with the Chiffons, He's So Fine. And of course there are similarities, and George would have heard that song, but had he deliberately put the two together? Probably not. And it's just packed with classics all the way through. Wow, wow, isn't it a pity? What is Life? It's just absolutely superb. I could go on and on naming the classic songs from this album, but I won't name them all. I'll just pick out another couple of highlights for me, being Apple Scruffs and the title track All Things Must Pass. Absolutely gorgeous. So it is an epic album. It is George's masterpiece. It's probably, when push comes to shove, is it the best album that a Beatle put out? Quite probably. But in terms of enjoyment, remember, that's where we're ranking this. Where am I going to put that? Well, I can't put it anywhere else other than number one, really. I would just be absolutely fooling myself and you if I tried to put it anywhere else. It's number one, but where will it finish when I smash this with John and Paul's albums in terms of enjoyment? That's interesting for me to see, so let's move on to that now. So we've now got 73 albums of George, John and Paul that are all now going to be smashed together to see where they end up. We will later on add Ringo into the mix, and then finally the Beatles. So I had Electronic Sound down at the bottom of my George rankings, but where does it sit overall? Well, I can certainly enjoy it more than Unfinished Music number 1 and number 2 by John Lennon. So it goes above those two, but because of the historical content of the interview parts of the wedding album, I'd probably put that above Electronic Sound. Electronic Sound is a mess. At many times it's unlistenable, but it's more listenable than those two John and Yoko albums. We've then got a lot of Paul albums. You know, as I said before in my John Lennon video, we've got obviously so many more Paul albums than John or George. So there's going to be a lot there, but sitting above the lower end of my Paul McCartney album ranking is, in place number 61, Dark Horse, which was next to last in my George ranking. We then go up a few places. We've got a couple of John Lennon albums above it, but then we've got in position 58, Extra Texture by George. We've then got a few more Paul albums until we get up to 53rd place, where I've put Live in Japan. I would say I find it more enjoyable than Driving Rain, but probably not quite as much as Broad Street by Paul. We've then got a few more Paul albums going up the chart until we get to position 48, where I've got Concert for Bangladesh by George, which I've got just above McCartney 3 Imagined. And just below Back to the Egg, which, as I've said a few times before, is not an album that I've always massively enjoyed. And I would rank Concert for Bangladesh sort of in there, similar. So moving up the chart then, we've got several Paul and John albums. Until we start to get near to the top 40, we've got Gone. Tropo is in there, just above the reconstructed Red Rose Speedway album by Paul, that double album that he released in his archive collection. A few more places up, ahead of a few Paul live albums. We've then got Somewhere in England by George at position 37. And then we've got several more Paul albums and Milk and Honey before we get to a little run where I put 3 George albums kind of together. And that's Wonderwall music, George Harrison, and 33 1/3. And I realised as I was putting this together that I couldn't justify putting any of those above Press to Play for me in terms of enjoyment. So so all three of those sat together. We're then moving up to position number 23, where we've got George's Brainwashed. And then moving up a little bit more, we're now into the top 20, where we've got CloudNine, just above Wings at the Speed of Sound, but just below McCartney 2. Several more places then before George appears again. He's moving quite high up the list here at number 14. It's Living in the Material World. And then that only really leaves us with All Things Must Pass. So where's it going to sit? Let's go up through this ranking that we've got so far. You can see that it's top 10 definitely. It's moving higher than that. It's above Flaming Pie and McCartney. I'd put it above Plastic Ono Band, above Band on the Run. I was really starting to think at this time, well, Imagine. I've said how much I enjoy Imagine. And I just thought that All Things Must Pass would go above that. And I couldn't quite put it above Ram. So All Things Must Pass sits in position number 2 in terms of my John, Paul, George ranking. In terms of best albums, I probably would put All Things Must Pass as number 1. But remember, I'm talking about my enjoyment of it. And my enjoyment of Ram probably just outstrips this. So when I did my John Lennon video in this series, I showed an average placing. So for John and Paul, where their albums on average appeared in my ranking list. And Paul was a couple of places ahead, as you can see there. Now we've got George to add to the mix. Let's have a look at what it's done. Well, I'm really surprised here. Being the huge Paul McCartney fan that I am, I thought he was going to run away with this. But it is really close. I've had to go to decimal places here. You'll see that Paul's average place in my ranking is at 36.5 and George 36.8. So it's really close there. I think the reason that John Lennon is suffering here is because he had those 3 experimental albums right at the start of his solo career that are right down at the bottom of the list. And I think that's done for his ranking. But I will show that and I will prove whether that's true or not when I've finished this series at the end of the Beatles ranking video. So, wow, we've done John, Paul and George. We have got 73 albums in our ranking so far. We've just got Ringo to go before we start trying to figure out where the Beatles fit in all of this. So let me know your thoughts on this down below. I'd love to hear from you as always. And I hope you can join me again for the next episode, which is Ringo. And I'll see you again very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.